Hey everyone, it's Scott from SertMedia.com, and in this video I'm going to be covering Swift Performance Cache Lite. Swift Performance Cache Lite is a freemium caching plugin that has sort of had a rise in popularity, and this is because it has a lot of functionality that you don't find in many other plugins. Now, I personally have experienced many issues with this plugin. I'll go into those later, but we're going to go ahead and install the plugin. If you get a setup wizard notification, all that you're going to do after installation is set to manual mode, and we're going to go through each of the settings and every one of the panels. So the dashboard area allows you to get quick access to log data as well as cache status. So for every page that exists on the website, it will list out the known pages, tell you how many are cached, how large the cache is, and how many threads are being used. If you've recently added pages and you see that it's not up to date, you can reset the warm-up table, as you could see, and it added all the pages. I imported a theme from ThemeForest, and I went ahead and installed all of its demo data, and this is what it pulled in. So you can go ahead and you can activate the start pre-build, and this will do a basic caching of the page. It'll go through and it will serve it as HTML file. But we're going to go to the settings panel and begin to configure it. Now, there is the simple view, which is what you're shown here. But if you want to get the full settings, you're going to go ahead and click Advanced View. Now, this allows you to see all features that are in the plugin, and we're going to go through every one that we physically can. There's only going to be the free features included in this video. In a later video, we will cover the pro version. So the first option is to disable cookies. This will just prevent the Swift Performance Cache from creating cookies on the front end. There's no real reason to ever enable this option. Cookies aren't much of an issue. You then have the pre-build booster. If you enable this, they will use less resources during pre-build. If you give the little question marks here at any point, if you click it, it will just give you a little pop-up to explain what it does. And then there's the debug log, which you should only use if you're experiencing an issue. Then we're going to go to the tweaks section. So the first option removes query strings from static resources. This should be checked. And then there is the prefetch DNS automatically. This will automatically get DNS prefetch requests, and it can even do so for third-party assets. Typically, I avoid enabling it for this option because many times when it merges third-party JS, you get a long line of prefetch requests that may not always be the same. If you use Google Ads, for instance, sometimes I may notice large amounts of prefetch requests that are simply not needed, but I do recommend that this option is enabled. And you can even exclude domains from DNS prefetching here. And then there's the Gravatar cache. If you have comments enabled, you should be caching Gravatars. And then I set the expiry date all the way to a month because Gravatars tend not to change too often once they're set. Then we have the heartbeat settings, and as I covered in the heartbeat control and WordPress Rocket videos, most of the settings tend to be just you increase the frequency to as high as you can, in this case up to 300 seconds. And then you can disable the heartbeat on various pages. Essentially, the only options that you can control here are the admin panel settings, so I just increase the frequency. Then you have cron jobs. This is a pro-only section, which allows you to optimize the usage of WordPress cron. Google Analytics, this will allow you to bypass Google Analytics by locally hosting the Google Analytics script. WordPress Rocket basically does a similar thing where it just rewrites the JS file and serves it locally. This requires you to put in your tracking ID, and then you can make additional changes here. This is not my preferred integration method. I prefer WordPress Rocket's integration, but this is a solid option if you're using Google Analytics. If you're using something like Google Sitekit, keep in mind that this will not work with that setup. You have to use this as your means of Google Analytics. And then the white label is, again, a pro-only feature. Under media, this is where you can get into some really important optimization features. While many of them are pro-only, these are the ones that I do recommend enable. You can inline small images. What this means is you will base64 encode an image, which basically just removes the HTTP request. And this can be beneficial, but in almost all situations, it's not. You could go ahead and do it, and then you could set the file size for amount of bytes. So this is about a kilobyte, 1 kilobyte size images, so small icons. This would be acceptable. I wouldn't set this to a large number though, because inlining very large images can have a really big impact on mobile device performance because the encoding process to transform that into an image can consume a lot of CPU cycles on a mobile device. You could choose to exclude images if you have found one of them to be broken because of this option here. And you just include the string or the URL to that image file. Lazy loading is a very simple process that we covered in the other video. This will lazy load the images. And the one thing I do recommend is lazy load images on user interaction. So this will load the full images only on user interaction. Instead, this is the recommended integration. That way images are not being loaded until the user scrolls or taps or does anything to interact with your page. And then you can use inline lazy load images. So basically, instead of serving a loader.gif image, it will inline it as base64 encoded to cut out the HTTP request. This is totally acceptable. This is what almost every other lazy load plugin does. You could force responsive images, which is when you have an image on the front end of your website and it does not have the source set attribute. This will attempt to set it. I don't recommend this option. Most of the time when this option is enabled, I notice that it causes more issues than it tends to resolve. And this is sometimes when you enable this option, you will see images on the front end where they load a smaller version than what was necessary. So I don't recommend enabling this option. It tends to be very finicky, especially if you have very complicated themes like this one that I'm working with that I found on Theme Forest. And there will be a video on this theme in the coming days. And then the media embeds, this will allow you to lazy load iframes. And then you can do the same thing, make sure that's only loading on interaction. Now, the feature in WordPress Rocket in that video I covered that has it replaces the YouTube player with an image. That is what this feature is, and it's locked behind the paywall. Under the optimization, this is where you're going to need to start being a little bit careful. Swift is a very, very, very aggressive caching plugin, and many times I find users who install it on a server and they end up consuming all of the disk space on that server. And that's because Swift is very aggressive in how it combines JavaScript. So we're going to go into all the settings and I'm going to try to explain what you should keep an eye on for. So merge assets for logged in users. If you are using something where users are logging in, something like BBPress, BuddyPress, anything where the user is logging in, this site uses both of them, then you have to enable this option for the merge settings to also work. If you're using the Pro version, you can get server push, and then you can optimize using pre-build only. Basically what this means is when the user's first visiting the page, the plugin is going to attempt to optimize that page. But this will tell it to say, hey, if the user's visiting the page for the first time, don't make them wait for the optimized version to be delivered to them. Instead, send them to the regular version and only optimize it in the background. And then optimize in the background, this is what you should be doing. And then you have the option to fix invalid HTML. Personally, I don't recommend enabling this option. I find that it causes more issues than it looks to resolve, but I do recommend minifying the HTML. And then if you are not using emojis, you can go ahead and disable the emoji.js here, and then limit simultaneous threads. What this does is it limits how many processes that Swift can open up at a time. Typically 3,000 threads is what I recommend. 3 threads. And then the DOM parser is the maximum size for DOM parsing in bytes. You don't really ever need to touch this option. And then you have the scripts option. So to do anything with the scripts option, you have to first enable merging of scripts. And then you can then choose to async the merge.js file, so it'll be loaded in a non-render blocking fashion. This file will also be loaded in the footer. You could choose to exclude third-party scripts altogether, if you so wish. Oftentimes this plugin does catch a lot of third-party JS that cannot be combined. So more or less you want to exclude this option if you have a lot of third-party assets you're using, share buttons, ads, so on and so forth. Or if you know what third-party JS you're using, just exclude the scripts below. You can then also choose to exclude inline scripts. This is something that the plugin does very aggressively, and this is where the issues actually begin. When you are merging inline JavaScript, most of the time a theme is using it and it has some sort of dynamic bite to it. So sometimes an inline asset may include the ID of the page. So if you're combining that into the merged file, and you have 1,000 pages on your website, every one of those pages is now going to have its own combined JavaScript file because of that one ID attribute. And this can cause your cache size to get very large. If all of your JS on your site comes out to be maybe 1 meg and that's uncompressed, you're now using about a gig's worth of data just to get the JavaScript merged. And this is one thing that WordPress Rocket tend to do a little bit better. And Auto Optimize doesn't even combine inline scripts by default. So typically, combining inline scripts is very dangerous because of its dynamic nature. So you'll have to just manually add exclusions for any inline dynamic resource that you find to prevent your cache size from exploding. I'm going to open up this site's and see if I can find something that's fairly dynamic. Here we go. So this has a nonce. A nonce can change from the page load. It can only have an hour-long time, and it's probably dynamic per page. So I would want to exclude something like ghostpool_voting. And this has to be done for any time you see a dynamic inline asset being served on the page. And it would take quite a while to look through all these scripts. There's 54 inline scripts on this home page for just comparison's sakes, and it could take quite a bit of time. First, this is another nonce, so we probably want to exclude this as well, and so on and so forth. I'm not going to mess around too much, but I recommend that you just work through it if you are using the merge.js functionality. And then you have the exclude script localizations. This should be enabled. Minified.js should be also enabled. This, for those of you who do not know, is it will exclude all inline scripts, which includes C data. So something that was like that nonce script, since it includes C data, this would be excluded. Minified JavaScripts, this should be enabled. Proxy third-party assets allows you to include URLs to third-party scripts, and this will attempt to replace it. It can do it with Google Analytics sometimes, and it's a fairly effective means. The one thing you have to keep in mind is that it has to be declared as a script source. So the format for whatever JS that you're trying to locally proxy has to be something like this, where it's source and then the clear URL. You can't use something like Google Tag Manager, which tends to embed it within an inline script itself. So if you have third-party assets that you want to proxy, you can do so here. Then you have the option to separate scripts. If you enable this option, it will save merge.js files for pages separately. This can help overcome issues with differences in pages. However, it also can cause your cache size to get fairly large. So it's important to experiment with this option, and depending on how your site's configured, you may want to enable it. This option is just experimental. You'll have to debug it to see if you need to enable this option. Then you have the option to print merge scripts inline. Never check this option. What this does is it takes all the JS that the plugin has aggregated and it loads it inline in the footer. While this removes the HTTP request, it adds a huge amount to the HTML document, which can really slow down render times. And it also eats up a large amount of the CPU time, and every time somebody visits another page, it now has to be re-downloaded, even if all the JS is exactly the same, because it's inlined in the HTML document. And then you can lazy load scripts. I'm not personally a fan of this option, and I'm going to explain why. When you lazy load JavaScript, you're not really optimizing the page in the traditional sense. What this does is you could take a JavaScript file, and let's just say I'm trying to find one JS file. Here we go. This infinite scroll. And then I paste it in here. And now what it will do is it will not download this JavaScript file until the user scrolls or clicks or does anything on the page. Now you might be wondering, what's wrong with this? And the answer is actually quite simple. Say you use an analytics script to track your bounce rates. If somebody goes to the page and doesn't do anything on it and just leaves right away, this would prevent that from working. But more importantly, this is oftentimes used as a means of bypassing measurements on performance tests. So if you enable this option, for instance, and you add your entire JS, let's say you have one JavaScript file for your whole website and you automatically put it in the footer. If you lazy load that until interaction, what will happen is the performance test will not measure its impact. So while you've done better on the performance test, you haven't actually fixed any real problems because the users are still going to have to download and wait for that asset to load. So if you've ever paid somebody to optimize your website, and they've added a lot of scripts to this section, it's kind of not resolving the issues. It's just bypassing them until you actually load the page and you scroll or tap or try to do anything. And here's the other issue that can occur. If you try to lazy load an asset that is dependent on the page, let's say you try to lazy load jQuery, and let's say you have a menu that is sticky like this one. Well, various parts of the site's HTML, JS rather, won't work. If you have a ticker or a slider or a chat widget, it will not load until you interact with the page. I'm not a fan of lazy loading scripts in this sense because it basically just masks the actual problem. But you can do it here if all you care about is a vanity performance score. And then you can choose to include scripts manually. If you know a script is going to be required and maybe the plugin is just missing it, you can include the script in the main JS file and remove it through whatever method you're using. So sometimes the plugin may not remove a JS file for some reason or another. But what you could do is you can give it the URL of that JS file. So think of the Google Tag Manager. Normally it has the inline script source. What this does is it allows you to give the URL to that tag manager. It will download the JS, merge it into your main JS, and then you can remove the call that you were originally using for the Google Tag Manager JS. Most of the time you won't need to do this, but it is there to help you diagnose issues. And then we have the styles section. Just like the JS, you have to make sure the options are merged. And then you have the option to generate critical CSS. Critical CSS is basically the CSS that's required to render the top of the page. So basically everything down to where you see this top user reviews, this is what the critical rendering path would be. Everything to get the top of this page visible to the user. Everything after, like the little button here for the videos section, those would not be downloaded in the original parsing of the HTML because the CSS file will then be lazy loaded with this option. So what you typically want to do is you want to merge styles. I recommend testing this option because it can severely improve the rendering speed of your websites, especially on mobile devices. Now, if you enable this option and you notice a flash of unstyled content, which is where the page is loading, but elements are looking misaligned. So let's say this 8 is like all the way over here, and the red is over here, and it all loads in a very odd fashion, then I would disable the option. But if you notice it loading pretty much how you would like, and it's resulting in better render speed, by all means make sure this option is checked, and it will attempt to automatically generate the critical CSS. Now, we have the option to compress the critical CSS for extra compression. You can go ahead and check this option. Just make sure that you're noticing not any strange issues. You can remove CSS keyframes, which are animations. I typically recommend trying this option. Animations are very intensive on mobile device CPUs in particular. So it's important to not load them when you're trying to just get the top of the page to load. And then you want to make sure the critical CSS is printed inline instead of a separate CSS file. That way it's not render blocking. And then you don't need to check essentially any of these other options. Don't ever check the print full CSS inline. And then you shouldn't need to check separate styles because styles tend to not be very dynamic. Make sure the minify CSS is just set to basic and you don't have access to the full version of it. With bypass CSS import, if you're using @import in a CSS file, this will go to that file that it's trying to @import, copy the CSS of that file, and merge it into the rest of the CSS. And then you can choose to exclude third-party CSS, notably Google fonts. I tend to not recommend loading Google fonts locally because the Google font CDN is very well optimized already. And it does a lot of optimizations on every browser load. But if you're trying to just get rid of the expires warnings that oftentimes come with GT Matrix, then make sure this option stays unchecked. And you're not able to set font display swap using this plugin. It's only available in the Pro version. Then we have the caching settings. This is where you actually get to the page caching optimization and tuning. You first have to make sure caching is enabled. And then with disk caching, it originally does it with PHP. So that means it's still having to hit PHP to send the user a cached version of the page. The most efficient option is to do disk cache with rewrites. I never recommend caching with memcaching. The reason you don't cache with memcaching is it's not really ideal for large payloads such as HTML files. And then I recommend you use the early loader. The cache path can stay the same. Set the cache expiry mode to either time or action based. It doesn't really matter. The cache expiry time being 12 hours is fine. I typically recommend 10 for an active website. The garbage collection interval running once every 30 minutes is acceptable. You could clear the cache on a post update by page. So select pages. You can select the pages here where the cache will always be cleared after a new post is published or updated. Normally you want to include your home page here. You could do the same thing here by just including the URL. And then you have the option to enable caching for logged in users. If you're using something like BBPress, BuddyPress, etc., do not enable this option. If you're using something like AMP or a mobile specific theme like WP Mobile, you're going to have to enable the mobile device cache right here. But if you're using a responsive theme, you do not need to check this option. You can enable browser caching, which basically just tells the browser to cache your CSS, your JS, and your images. And then you can enable gzip compression. You could send a 304 header, which tells the browser whether a page has been updated or not. So the browser will cache the HTML, and if the 304 header tells it that it's been updated, it will then re-download the HTML file and try to cache it locally. Typically, this option I leave disabled, and the reason for that is it most of the time tends to cause more issues than it's meant to. If you've ever updated a page and you cleared your Swift performance cache, and then you've gone back to the home page and you notice that it hasn't been updated, that can very well be the reason why. You can cache 404 pages as well, but the issue with caching 404 pages is it may return a 200 status code, which can cause issues. I tend not to cache 404 pages unless I've tested it to make sure that it's returning a 404 error and not an HTTP 200. And then the enable dynamic caching allows you to choose assets that get cached that are using a query string. So an S would be for your search pages. And then you can also choose to cache AJAX actions. So if you're using a WP admin.ajax.php, you can include actions here that can then be cached and served from the disk or in the database. And the issue with this is it can oftentimes break the functionality, but it can also really improve the download speed of those actions. One thing that's worth trying is if you're using a Visual Composer based website and you're using a grid from Visual Composer, try adding the action from the grid request into the cacheable AJAX actions. Unfortunately, trying to determine what the action is very difficult. So if I come over to the Network Request tab, I can then just load the page, and I'm going to look for AJAX. So we have ajax.loop, but we don't have anything for admin AJAX. So we're going to go ahead and go to a games page that it has pre-built, Power Rangers Legacies, and now we're just going to let it try and see if we have any AJAX requests going on. We're going to go ahead and so we don't seem to have any AJAX request being fired. Here we go. Admin.ajax.php. And then what you can do is you can look for an action code in the response, and there doesn't appear to be any for this asset. But you can go ahead and you can look in the response headers and in the response itself to see if it's sending an action with the AJAX request. This one actually doesn't seem to be sending any response header, which is quite odd, or at least any response code. So very useful option, but you have to test it. And oftentimes it does lead to breakage because AJAX requests are meant to be dynamic in the first place. And then we have the tweaks section. Everything in here is only behind the paid version paywall. Exceptions allow you to exclude post types, pages, and URLs that you don't want to be cached. One thing that I do recommend changing from the default is to make sure author pages are indeed cached. You can choose to exclude REST URLs if you are using the REST API, but if you aren't, you can just go ahead and cache them anyways, so that way it reduces the resources on the front end. And then the feed, if you're using an RSS feed reader and you have a lot of users who subscribe via that method, it might be worth testing to see if you can cache the feed URLs to reduce load on the server. The warm-up allows you to choose what gets pre-built, so the posts, the pages are automatically pre-built. And you can, I recommend choosing the option to pre-build the cache automatically. And then the pre-build speed, depending on how fast your hosting is, you can either choose moderate, slow, or reduced. Moderate is typically defined what you need. And then you have the pre-build author pages. I recommend enabling this. Pre-build the archive. I recommend doing this. And then the REST URLs in the feed, you don't really need to preload. Underneath varnish, if you have a varnish caching system set up on the host, you can choose to auto purge it here. And if you're using something like Cloudflare, you need to include the host. So include the IP address here to resolve cache clearing issues. And then the app cache allows the full site to be cached in the browser itself. So you can choose to either cache the whole website or to include a specific page. I haven't really ever used these options for anything, and there's not really a good reason to. I've done another video on a plugin called Super Progressive Web App, which allows your website to be installed kind of like an app on your phone. And I recommend you check that video out because using a service worker to allow users to cache pages for offline use is far more effective, and I think it would be less finicky than the app cache itself. And then you have the traditional CDN option, which allows you to include the CDN hostname. I do recommend that you enable the CDN on SSL. Your whole website should be over SSL in 2020. Cloudflare, you can enable auto purging of Cloudflare here by including the account email API key, and then the Cloudflare host URL, and then the Max CDN is a specific setup for Max CDN. You can export and import your settings right here to download copies or import them into your website after you've done a migration. And then we have the image optimizer setting. This is only locked behind the premium version. Basically what it does is that allows you to compress the images as you would expect in a lossless or lossy version. I would say it's on par with most of the competition. It's just another option. You may want to test out some of the competition using the online optimization tools. ShortPixel and Imagify. TinyPNG is another one that has a free online tool that you can test. I would go ahead and test those to see which ones you're getting the best compression out of. The database optimizer, this is a free version, and it allows you to optimize various parts of the database. You could choose to optimize all of your tables here, which will just go ahead and run the optimize query to remove overhead. You can clear expired transients. It will let you know if your auto-loaded data is too large. 0.12 megabytes isn't very large. Typically anything over 1 megabyte is a serious issue and it needs investigation. Terms and users allows you to choose to delete orphaned and duplicated user meta as well as term meta. Revisions, you can delete your post revisions and trash posts. You can run orphaned data to be deleted, including orphaned attachments. And then the same thing for comments. The critical font feature is locked behind the paywall as well. There is the plugin organizer feature, which we're going to touch on this briefly. So plugin organizer allows you to choose when a plugin is allowed to run. So let's take WP Reset. You could choose to disable it or enable it on a certain URL. So if I choose to disable it on the front end, I can add that rule. Or if I choose to enable it on a certain URL, I can add that rule, and so on and so forth. It's a good means of trying to optimize the loading of plugins, but typically what I recommend doing is using something like asset cleanup. It tends to be a lot more configurable without causing issues for you to manage down the line. And then we just go back to the dashboard, and that's really all there is. I'm going to show you what a pre-build would look like for one of these pages with these settings. So I'm going to run it on the home page. We're going to tell it to cache the URL. It's going to go ahead and start firing the process right here. It will pre-build, so it's cached HTML, 0.29 megabytes is about right. And it looks like it's basically good. We're gonna go ahead and just run a save for our settings that we have set, because I don't believe we did that over here. And now we're gonna go back over here and we're going to tell it to clear the cache and then cache this page once again. This is a very powerful plugin, but it's also very prone to causing problems. It's going to cache the one page, and we're just going to reload it to make sure that it does indeed work. We're going to revisit our optimization features. They looked like they were not saved. Either way, very powerful plugin. It's just very prone to causing issues. I recommend after you enable this plugin, monitor your site for a couple of hours. So you enable it and then let it run through and do a full preload, and then check back on the site maybe that night. So if you set it up like in the early morning, check your site later in the evening, 5 o'clock or so, and just make sure that the cache size hasn't gotten too large. Check it via FTP or your file manager, and just make sure that the cache size hasn't exploded to something unreasonable and it's consuming large resources on the host, because it can get you into trouble with your host and they will ask you to remove the plugin. If you have any questions about the configuration, please feel free to ask in the comments below. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and goodbye.